You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Megan Krakouer is the definition of a caring, community-minded Australian. As you're about to hear, I met her at the funeral of my cousin, Cassius Turvey, the 15-year-old First Nations boy whose violent death in Perth united Australians to demand an end to racism. Megan is a lawyer who saves lives through her work in suicide prevention and trauma recovery. I've witnessed her enormous heart in action. There is nothing she wouldn't do to help our most vulnerable. In a country where the rate of incarceration, suicide and poverty is disproportionately higher for First Nations people, she is an advocate and a voice for those constantly failed. There needs to be hundreds of Megans in Australia, and as you're about to find out, hopefully there will. Also, just a note, you'll hear some birds, planes and dogs in the background of Megan's audio because she was recording this outside in the sun on country. I'm Narelda Jacobs, hosting No Filter today, talking to my incredible guest and sissy, Megan Krakouer. Of all the people on this earth, Megan Krakouer, you give all of yourself to your community and mob, and I've seen that firsthand. We first met, I might have met you as a little kid running around, but the first time we met as grown women was at Cassius Turvey's funeral. And you worked really closely with Auntie Michelle, and in fact, you were the organiser of all the vigils around the country.
Yeah.
It was 50 vigils.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Of course, we wish that there wasn't any vigils or any rallies, but it came down to Michelle. She was just a woman of so much class and integrity, and she basically shared her grief with the full nation.
Michelle, it's impossible to imagine the pain that you and your family are going through. What has the community support meant to you?
So much. It's actually helping us all with our healing day by day. The generosity of people wanting to give us things, from simple things from hugs to, a piece of their artwork, also getting behind the vigils, the rallies, as well, is absolutely amazing. And there's also triggers for some people that have encountered similar, or have tragedies, Last night we were at Cassius's memorial tree in Middle Swan, and a stranger came past, sat in his car, and I let a family member know, hey, he can get out, he was respecting our privacy. And I asked, did you know my son? He said no, and he didn't live anywhere near the suburb, but this tragedy has touched him because he lost his best friend who was murdered, so he felt healing by sitting around Cassius' tree. So that's just one small example.
Basically, there were people reaching out left, right and centre. They wanted to do something. They felt like they wanted to contribute to help them with their healing journey. And that's when Michelle and I thought, okay, well, let's do something. And it got from a couple of rallies and a couple of vigils, then all of a sudden it's grown out to 20, 30 and now 50 right across the country, and even some in international locations. But, it's full testament and strength to Michelle because of the woman that she is, in terms of just her love for her people, the way that she conducted herself and the way that she shared her grief with the nation. It's a very hard thing to do, but she was just absolutely incredible, and she's a woman that I have so much love and respect for, and that'll continue on for years to come.
And Megan, you're usually someone who is front and centre at rallies and protests, but this was a vigil and there was a conscious decision not to show anger at the vigil. You made sure the wishes of Auntie Michelle was passed on to all of the organisers of all the vigils around the country. And that was a conscious decision. Why didn't you want it to be a show of anger?
So when I'd found out what happened to little fella, rest in peace, I'd made contact with Michelle, and I needed to see her over the next day or two. This is when I made contact, because I was going up to the Northern Territory, When I came back, Michelle and we spoke, and we basically wanted to get a statement. And the statement had to come from Michelle about what she wanted to go across to all the rallies, all the protests, all the vigils right across the country. When we do work in the community, whether it's a death in custody, whether it's someone who's been a child removals, homelessness, it's always done in partnership with the families. And the family, we need to ensure that they have voice because it's their story, it's their truth. So we basically had to stick in line with what Michelle wanted. She wanted that solidarity. She had the big message, violence feeds violence. And she wanted about the love and the care and the awareness and so forth. So for me, as someone on the front line, that's definitely not the talk that I usually do. It's very hard-hitting, it's very straight. It's basically saying, government, this is how you're failing, this is the racism, discrimination and all the issues that come with it. But Michelle very much set the tone, and out of respect, that's what we wanted to ensure got out to every single rally, vigil, protest right across the country. There were people from the Aboriginal Tent Embassy that were part of it. They was able to send information through to sister girls up in Sydney, sister girls over in South Australia. And so, there were a lot of people really angry. They were outraged. They wanted to take it further, but a lot of people made sure that they were very much in line with what Michelle wanted. She is the mother of Cassius, rest in peace, and we had to show and honour that respect.
Oh, and it was done in such a beautiful way that united Australia, and it was just incredible to see people from all walks of life coming together for all of those vigils to pay their respects to a family that had so much dignity. It was a unifying moment. And then a couple of days after Cassius's funeral, I sat down and had a yarn with you, and we ended up yarning for 3 hours. And it was sitting down with you, Megan, was just, that was also an incredible experience. This was happening in Perth a few days after we laid Cassius to rest. And I couldn't help but emerging after those 3 hours and thinking, where have I been? You gave me the brutal truth of the place that I had grown up in and the place that I had worked on my career and had, career success. And then, I left it to go to Sydney and, experience more success and, working hard and doing all the things that we were told that we need to do to be successful. And you gave me the brutal, honest truth. And you said to me, all this talk about the deficit discourse, we're forgetting what Black excellence is actually, what it actually is. What is Black excellence in your mind?
And someone who can survive an arc of issues, the death in custody, child removal, someone who's gone from being homeless, now securing their own property, someone who basically, a mother or a grandmother that manages to keep 5, 10, 15, 20 kids plus the other 30 or 40 grandchildren out of the system, or if they're in the system, helping and supporting. That's Black excellence to me, many people define it as someone with degrees and platforms and positions, and to me it's not that. A grandmother who looks after all her children and her grandchildren, and she's just so humble, but she doesn't get the recognition. To me, that's Black excellence. She makes sure that they're fed, they've got a roof over their head. It's just absolutely incredible.
Now, what are you recording me?
First stop, Nan Cox here. Nan, you just said something really beautiful to me. What did you say just then about what's the most important thing in life?
I said money's not everything in life. All you got, if you got happiness and love of family and everyone around you, you're happy.
Yeah.
You're more than happy. I just so pleased that I've got a lot of lovely friends and family that I can count on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't beat that.
Well, that's your influence too, because you've been an incredibly strong figure in your family, and what your children and grannies have gone on to do is just sensational.
Yes, I'm so proud of my grannies and that of what they've done and how they live life. And some of the girls got babies, but they're so beautiful mothers to their children.
The other thing too, Narelda, just us going out on those that day with the visits,
Yeah, I'll set the scene. So hearing that from you in that 3 hours was actually life-changing for me. And I'm actually really ashamed to say that, because I should have been aware and championing mob more than I had been, rather than just kind of worrying about my own career. That's kind of how I felt like I'd been living a really selfish life. And so I contacted you when I knew that I was coming back just before Christmas to Perth. And I said to you, the families that you go and visit, do you think they would want a Christmas ham? And you were like, yeah, and they'd probably want toys as well for the kids. So I just asked a couple of my friends, and they wouldn't want to be mentioned, but I'm going to mention them. I just kind of was chatting to Melissa Leong and Tasma Walton and a couple of close friends of mine, Jill Goodwin and Marion Towndrow, and they all were like, well, how much are these individual hampers going to cost? And I was like, well, probably $200. I had the money in my account right then and there, and went out and bought these Christmas hams and toys for, children, and wrapped the presents and had these hampers ready to go. And you had 5 families that you had in mind to go and visit, which for me that day was another life-changing day. Mm. The impact that it had on me has stayed with me, and I have told the stories of the families that we visited. It was a heavy day for me, but you actually said that it was a lovely day for you, that it was a happy day for you.
Yeah, it was. Because all the focus was on you. Families wanted to have a yarn with you, and they were so impressed with you, and, you've been off making your career, but that doesn't mean to say that we're not proud of you. So, it's a bit of a big deal, you coming out to the families, and some were really quite surprised, but at the same time very blessed. So we're proud of everything that you've achieved.
All right, we've got a car loaded full of Christmas presents, bobtails in the back helping us. Megan, what are we about to do?
Oh, look, we're absolutely blessed that Narelda's given up her time to come and have a yarn with some of the families that we work with. Narelda's a huge icon in Noongar country, very much right across the country. But, it's about a time of giving and love and sharing and showing that respect for each other, and we're very honoured, as Narelda is, to meet with some of the families, and we're just going to cruise around Perth and check it out with the family. But yeah, some of the families that we're going to catch up with, we've known for weeks, years. We've had a really strong connection with some of the families that have been affected by deaths in custody, suicide, incarceration, child removal. So there's some really hard issues that some of the families are working with. So we're really blessed to be able to have this time with Narelda today. I guess in terms of the deficit discourse, this is what we're dealing with every single day. So with the National Suicide Prevention Trauma Recovery Project for the last 3 years, and predominantly it's been unfunded, but, about 22,000 people, the most marginalised, the most vulnerable, the impoverished, Department of Child Protection, homelessness, incarceration, deaths in custody, domestic violence. We recognise that it is a poverty narrative right across the country. We know that right across the country, Aboriginal people, we fall below the poverty line by 40%. In Western Australia, it's 60%. In the Northern Territory, it's 80%. So when you're talking about the poverty line, you're thinking about the Henderson poverty line, and that's about $460 per week. If you think about it in the context of Centrelink, a person in receipt of Centrelink may get about $560 a fortnight, so they fall below the poverty line. In terms of child removals, the stolen generation, it hasn't stopped. It's just become more sophisticated. In 1997, when they had the Bringing Them Home report, there were 2,000 black kids in care. The Prime Minister in 2008, the apology to the stolen generation, there was 8,000 black kids in care. Right now it's 23,000 black kids in care. So in the last 15 years, we've moved away from 1 in 3 children, like black kids in care, to 1 in 2, because right across the country there's 46,000 kids in care, and we make up half of that. In terms of, the prison system, right across the country there's about 142 carceral estates, and 17 of those are youth detention centres. So there's about 40,000 people in the prison system. In Western Australia, as we speak right now, there's 1 in 12 Aboriginal people from Western Australia in a prison today.
1 in 12.
In terms of suicides, you go back 10 years ago, it was 1 in 23 First Nations people to take their lives. Within the last 10 years, it's gone down to 1 in 16. And that's very much consistent with the closing the gap, the targets, because the ones that aren't closing, suicides, incarceration and child removals.
Megan, suicide, incarceration and child removals, is there a direct link with poverty?
Absolutely. It's a poverty narrative. So there's big disconnect sometimes between the haves and the have-nots, and you really need to immerse yourself into the deficit discourse. You need to understand. You need to speak to the mothers, the grandmothers, the children, to really, truly understand the problems that we're facing as a community right across the nation. And then you have to start taking into account the diversity of the 1,200 remote communities. So immersing yourself with the people, sitting down listening to their stories, whether it's about them losing somebody, whether it's about a child that's been removed, what's been their experience trying to get their child back out of care. And many families will say it's absolutely destroyed them. Some are no longer here to tell their story.
So that's why you say Black Excellence is about surviving, because how do you lift yourself out of that poverty when you're just trying to hold it together? You know, like quite often I have, when I've been with my like non-Aboriginal friends, a couple of times just in recent months, people have said to me, you know, when I've tried to open up the conversation about, you know, we live in a racist society, and quite often the reply will be, well, Aboriginal people need to do more to help themselves. But how do you help yourself when surviving takes everything you've got because you're living in a colony?
That's exactly right. I mean, for our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, and unaddressed trauma kills. Intergenerational trauma, which is unaddressed, kills. So for some of our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, it's like, how do you cope that you've just lost someone to suicide? How do you cope at the same time if you've got housing issues? How do you cope at the same time if you've got issues with putting food on the table for your family? How do you cope when you can't go down the road and visit your family because you've got no car, no licence? How do you cope when you don't have a birth certificate? See, what happens with a lot of our people, there is so much unaddressed trauma, and it's one trauma after the next. And if you can't disable the trauma, you can't set in place positive pathways. So in many senses, there's a lot of people. I've been at conferences, I've mixed right across the country with a lot of people who fall below the poverty line. It's very similar type circumstances. Yes, I've just lost 2 or 3 people to suicide, and they were nephews or grandsons. Yes, I've just had somebody pass away. And with Aboriginal people, in the context of Australia, there's about 800,000 First Nations people. In terms of total population, it's about 25 million. So yeah, we want to help ourselves, but it's really quite difficult if you put into a context a person coming out of the prison system, not leaving with birth certificate, not leaving with photo identification other than the little paper that says, hey, you just got out of prison today. And if they've been in prison for more than 3 years, their bank accounts would have closed. So if that person doesn't have that support, the intense psychosocial support, the assertive outreach, where someone can pick them up, take them to the bank, have their ID and make sure that they've got accommodation, that person is basically likely to go back into the prison system because they haven't been supported in ways that should. But the unaddressed trauma kills.
So you can hardly present your prison slip and walk into a real estate office and get a rental, or you can hardly take it to a business and get a job if you're showing your prison slip.
Well, that's exactly right, and I'll give you a situation. There was a young lady, she came out of the prison, and what she did, they asked her for, she wanted to stay at a hotel, and they said, have you got photo ID? Well, she'd only just got out. She didn't have any photo ID other than the little slip to say that she'd been released from prison that day, and then they basically said, well, no, you can't stay here. So the discrimination straight away.
If we look at child protection, which is, I mean, would you call it crisis and epidemic in Australia? What's going on?
100%. It's a child protection right now for us mob. It's the worst it's ever been in the history of this country.
You just talked about how it was 2,000 Aboriginal children that were removed, and then it kind of jumps up and now 23,000. When, you know, we're talking about 800,000 First Nations people in this country, and 23,000 children are in state care.
Correct.
That is a worrying, alarming percentage of children. It is like another stolen generation, really, when you think about it like that. That day that I was with you, we met with a family who was about to go to a mediation with the Department of Child Protection, and we were observers. Well, I was an observer in that meeting, and you were advocating for them or supporting the family. We were supporting the family. It ended up being a 2-hour meeting. They had been fighting for 2 years to get the 3 children back. The mum did have some issues with substances, but her family was incredibly strong. There were several family members that could have taken the children.
That's correct.
But they were with a foster family that was not related to them. So this is a family who has not had the children for 2 years. The bar to remove children, from what I could gather in that one meeting, the bar to remove children is so low, but it is almost insurmountable to get them back.
And you said that absolutely beautifully. See, when you're dealing with Department of Child Protection in Western Australia, they have something called the burden of proof. So when you have the burden of proof, in criminal matters, it's beyond reasonable doubt. When you're dealing with child protection, it's just on the balance of probabilities. So there's been many times when there's children that's been removed, the police have investigated a particular matter or an allegation, there hasn't been any evidence, and the child still remained in care.
For example, a broken bone?
That's exactly right. So if a child has gone up, and this has happened in a number of cases where a family's taken their child to the hospital to get them checked out by the doctors and to help them because of mandatory reporting requirements.
Well, let's just talk about this family specifically because it was absolutely outrageous, the things I heard in that meeting.
Yeah.
In the 2 years that these 3 children had been in state care, they had presented to hospital 6 times with broken bones.
Mm-hmm.
This is in state care.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meeting, the family was saying they were so frustrated because they were like, the children never went to hospital when they were with us.
That's right.
You intervened in the meeting and you said if the tables were turned, there would be no way the children would be staying in that environment.
Absolutely.
Because the broken bones would be investigated and the children would be removed.
Exactly.
There are other examples of that happening.
Yeah, that's correct. And so, it's a very staunch family. There's a lot of love there. On top of that, there's a lot of stability. But it's just really frustrating because it was very easy to take the children away. But in terms of reunification, the mum, she'd been trying her best, and even the grandfather had basically been trying his best to have the children put back into their care. But all the hurdles that they have to jump one after the next, it becomes really quite problematic and really quite stressful. I mean, basically it's a no-brainer. Let the kids go back to its natural family. They have got an incredible setup. There is a strength behind the family to provide the mother that supports, but the department just basically wouldn't have a bar of it. So they're basically in a plan at the moment with the family, but the plan is really quite frustrating, even to the point, and Narelda, I know you were sitting next to the young girl when they said on Christmas Day one of her children didn't want to be with her.
Oh, she broke down. It was just heartbreaking.
But this is what's happening over here in WA and very much right across the country. Child protection is not getting any better, but in particular with that family, it makes no sense that there hasn't been an assessment done on the grandfather. And it makes no sense that they can't put in place a plan which is workable. In terms of supervised visits, you go into an office, and this is what she has to do. You go into an office and you're being supervised to have visits with your children. Mm. But the process can take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes people just get burnt out by the whole process because the supports aren't there. They're going through all these different legal avenues. They don't understand totally what it means in relation to a 2-year order, an 18-year order. So there's a lot of people that come into contact with the Department of Child Protection and do not understand the way forwards.
In addition to the 6 hospitalisations amongst these 3 children, one of the children was mauled by a dog at the house, a dog that lived at the house, and suffered horrific injuries, head injuries. And then that's not enough grounds for the children to be back with their family. I put myself in the shoes of this family who want the 3 children back. There are several family members who have immaculate homes, who are stable. They are leaders in the community, and the department is still not having a bar of it. It takes a child to be mauled. It takes for broken bones, 6 hospitalisations, and the children are still not given back to their family where there was no harm that came to them whatsoever. It is mind-boggling. I could not believe it that people sit in those meetings and not become enraged. What I loved was sitting next to you, and you had a way of intervening every now and then and paraphrasing what was being said, but paraphrasing it in a way that was putting it back on the department that made it sound like it was just ridiculous. Their arguments were ridiculous, but you were actually saying back to them what they were saying to the family, but when you said it, it just sounded different.
Yeah. Jerry George Artis and I, we've been on about 140 safety plans right across the country, and we've always managed to keep children with their mothers, even at the hospitals. When Department of Child Protection have said, we're taking your child from the hospital, we've intervened to make sure that mother leaves that hospital with that child. But we've been on a number, over 140 safety plans, and we've always been successful with reunifications and keeping children with parents. One of the big issues, and I felt so much sadness, and it really hurt me, because I did see Mum, and yes, she has been to prison. I seen the grandmothers, the mother. It was like they were begging to have their child back. They were begging to have their children back. Yeah, may have been some issues and so forth, but you have to support these families. And that's one of the issues with Department of Child Protection and its counterparts right across the country. It's an $8 billion budget. $8 billion budget, but only 17% is spent on family supports. That family needed to be supported in that sense. But, I mean, the other thing too, those investigations, even though the family made these complaints about what's happened, the department have said that they've investigated and they're quite happy with the investigations and the outcomes of it, so they haven't progressed it any further.
Oh, you're kidding. So the children are not going to be going back to the family?
Not anytime soon. So they're trying to work out some plan where they can build up the contact. But the grandfather, he about to have an assessment, which is good. That'll assess whether or not he's, good enough to be a carer. So I'm pleased that process is happening, but it shouldn't have got to where it's at today, particularly when there is stable accommodation. Bottom line is the family should have been supported in the first instance. Don't have 80%, 87%. Of a $8 billion budget across the country to basically remove kids, police kids, surveillance homes. It's really shocking when the Department of Child Protection walks into a house. Oh, let me have a look how much food you got in the fridge. Oh, by the way, let me have a look how much food you've got in the cupboard. Let me check all the rooms. That's surveillance at its best, and it doesn't help the families in any shape or form. They need to be supported. It's simple.
$8 billion could be well spent on strengthening families and preventing children from being removed in the first place. And by the way, how many non-Aboriginal families are there where drugs are in the home or accidents, genuine accidents happen that do not come under the radar? There is just such a double standard. Like anything is treated suspiciously when it's a black family. People wonder why there is mistrust or, disengagement with authorities or hospitals or police. It's for that reason.
Exactly. So, I love my community. I love our people, and we'll always stand up for the most marginalised and vulnerable, the voiceless, the people that are silenced, and we'll always try and work with them to ensure that their voices are at the centre of the conversations. But to see, hear, feel what's happening in our community and the appropriate supports up there. A lot of people try their best with what they have. There's a lot of Aboriginal services in the community that try their best, but sometimes they just don't have the mandate. So, for example, the Aboriginal medical services, they do as best as what they can, but they can't work after hours. It's not in their mandate. What we need is the intense psychosocial support, the assertive outreach, which is 24/7. Go to the people. Sometimes the homes that you're going to, there's going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 different people in the house, and then you have to unpack the issues, help them with Department of Housing. But even when you do Department of Housing, the wait list can be 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years in some cases.
You can't be there every time an Aboriginal person is arrested, say, or you can't be there every time children are removed, or you can't be there every time somebody walks out of prison. You can't be there to advocate for everyone when they're at their most vulnerable and they need it. And you can see why the numbers just keep compounding, the amount of arrests when people don't deserve to be in custody. They've done nothing to deserve being in custody. When people just fall through the cracks of not being able to get that job or do that thing that will take them to the next level towards not just surviving, but just, thriving just a tiny little bit more. You can't be there every time. So what I wanted to talk to you about next is one of the homes that we visited on that day, there were a lot of siblings. I think they were in their 30s, late 20s to maybe late 30s or so. They each had children amongst them. And when we got talking to them, I quickly discovered that all of their children had been taken away because their mum had passed away recently. And because the mum was the matriarch of the family, once she passed away, the Department of Child Protection swooped on this family and took all the children away. And when we left that home, I said to you, who was their mum? And what did you say to me?
Yeah, it's my sister, rest in peace.
Oh, Megan, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that you lost your sister recently and that this is what's happened after.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're no different to many other families, even though we may have all these platforms and degrees and so forth. We're no different to any of the other families, so we never judge, because my family is no different to many of the other families and having the same struggles with suicides, incarcerations, child removals, homelessness. It's very much within my family as in many other people's families, and that's why I'll never think that I'm better than anyone else, because we're all brother and sister of the human family and we're all experiencing this together. But we do fight back and we do speak up in terms of the deficit discourse and the failures, and that's really quite important, the voices of many, and that's what's actually happened with the Banksia Hill class action, and that's why it is where it is today, because the family spoke up, the young ones spoke up, the older ones spoke up, and the media are absolutely incredible in terms of taking story out after story after story. So we've managed to abate the prison system in terms of incarceration, with families saying, no, I wasn't treated good. This is my experience. This is what happened to me when I was there. So every time the department came out and said, well, it's therapeutic, there's a lot of rehabilitation, there's opportunities, some of the children, and we've taken about 700 testimonies right across the state of Western Australia, said, no, that's not the case. This is what happened to me. This is where I was failed. And I could go through the failures and it's just absolutely horrendous.
And this is coming to light because you sit down and you yarn with these people. You want to hear their stories and you empower them to tell their stories.
Yep. And we do it together. We fight together. We basically elevate the deficit discourse together, and we take it to unprecedented and basically challenge the system, challenge the status quo to say, no, sorry, we're people. This is our story. These are our circumstances. But you know what? We're not totally at fault here. This is the government. Where is the government's responsibility to ensure that every single person, whether you're black, white or brown, have their own home in Western Australia and very much across the country? That is a government responsibility. They say, well, go and get a rental. We know that there's a lot of discrimination and racism where Aboriginal people, when they apply for homes, I know of people who's applied 60, 70 times, didn't get it.
Your sister, may she rest in peace, at her home, there was a beautiful young man that you introduced me to who had an electronic bracelet on his ankle.
Yep.
Can you tell me about him?
Yeah, so he's basically been in Banksia Hill a couple of times. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He's also one of the lead plaintiffs with the Banksia Hill class action.
What did he experience behind bars?
Basically, he was locked down 24/7. He was being fed through the grill. He experienced racist taunts, which were really quite disturbing. Black this, black that, you're a silly kid. He did tell me about him being in there for 24 hours one time, or a number of times, and basically being fed through the grill. And the food was absolutely atrocious. Telephone calls, family contacts. Basically, there was hardly any of that, if any.
And was he given his medication?
He says that he wasn't, and that obviously impacted on him. But here you are in a little cage, not getting the support, no one coming to see you. That's going to have an impact on anyone, whether it be me, you, anybody who's locked up in those conditions for 23, 24 hours a day. It makes a person worse.
And when you hear stories like that and then you hear comments like Aboriginal people need to do more to help themselves, when you're locked up for 24 hours a day in solitude and you're not given the basic medical care that you need, and these are children. Banksia Hill is for children.
That's exactly right. And that's what I was alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. It is the poverty narrative. So if you've got young ones who's basically staying in overcrowded housing, and this does happen in our community, I'm not disparaging, I'm just basically saying what the deficit discourse is and being very quite truthful. Sometimes the children, they're in the shops there, they're stealing to stay alive, stealing to put some food in their belly. There's been stories where young ones have deliberately perpetrated a crime, smashed a window, waited for the police to come and pick them up so they could go and stay in Banksia Hill for the night or the next couple of nights, because in that way they would have a shower, they'd have some food. What's our society coming to when that actually happens with our young people? I'll just smash a window because I've got nowhere to stay on the outside.
Megan, the issues, the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that you see, did it all start from January 26, 1788?
The intergenerational trauma, absolutely. The decimation and the smashing of the culture. And then you've seen what's continued as a result, the intergenerational trauma, the massacres, the rapes, the murders. It's been highly problematic. And it actually has cost many people's lives, and that's the day that we can never forget. I choose not to commemorate that particular day, and that's one of the reasons why.
It's not a date to celebrate.
No, it's not a day to celebrate at all. It's a day which is about mourning, and it's really quite hurtful because it's about our ancestors. It's about the decimation, the smashing and the destroying of our culture. It's about the intergenerational trauma and how issues have not got any better. It's about so much more than just changing a date. But that particular day, it's very painful to many.
Getting back to how I started and talking about Black excellence, and while we do celebrate people who have graduated and become doctors and specialists and, you know, human rights lawyers and top chefs, you know, all of that incredible, you know, fashion designers, international models, and all of the people that we celebrate and we hold up. Black excellence really is about surviving, is intergenerational survival. That's what it is absolutely about. What help can we give you to ensure that that survival continues?
Absolutely. And, you know, I applaud our brothers and sisters that are doing remarkably well. I applaud our people that have gone on the international stage and basically got law degrees and, you know, become graduates from universities and so forth. But I think there's many people, even though you're in all these positions or wherever you are, do not forget about your people. Do not forget about the deficit discourse. If you do, are you even positively helping to change this narrative? So regardless of whether you're a big-time lawyer, regardless of whether you're a politician, do not forget about the people, and don't just speak to the people or heads of organisations. Go to the grassroots people that these ones are speaking to or speaking about, because too often what happens with a lot of us mob, people speak about us without us. We've got our own voices. Our families have their own voices. Let them be front and centre of these conversations. Don't speak up for us if you don't know us. Regardless of whether you're Aboriginal, whether you're not Indigenous, don't speak without us.
And Megan, when your phone goes off at 1 a.m. and you run out, you know, in your car to pick somebody up and prevent them from taking their own life, you don't get paid for that.
No.
What can we do to help you?
Well, we've got a GoFundMe page. We set it up about 3 years ago. I've only just brought it back to life over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Most of the donations to the GoFundMe page is absolutely really quite helpful because we help people out with moving into accommodation, also food vouchers, fuel vouchers. There was one through the GoFundMe page and we didn't raise that much money, but there was a woman who she'd lost her partner to suicide. Her child had cancer. She had to not work anymore because she was looking after her child. She had to move from a house to another house, but the $400 that people had donated into the GoFundMe page, that had gone towards helping her with her private rental, the bond, and then basically another $400 with food. So that went a long way.
Well, $400, which for a lot of us is something that we could kind of just donate quite easily, but it would go such a long way. And will you be bringing on staff that can be other Megan Krakouers?
So we just received a Commonwealth grant for $100,000 through the National Indigenous Australian Agency. It's a 10-week program. As part of that 10-week program, there's now 6 of us working, 4 that are working part-time, and they're absolutely incredible, staunch, beautiful advocates out in the community, and they know community. So we're very lucky in relation to that. But after that time expires, we'll just have to wait and see what happens, trying to get some more funding so we can keep the program going, but at the same time trying to build it to such a level where we've just got a huge amount of staff working with the most marginalised and vulnerable. So we're trying to grow it. But that's where we've got funding from at this point, the National Indigenous Australian Agency, which we're incredibly thankful for.
Beautiful sunset. It's been a big day. Thank you so much, Megan.
Welcome. Really happy to come out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, little fella. So great to hang out with you, Bobtail. Oh, so much has happened today. My heart is so full, and I will be drawing on this experience for many, many conversations in lots of different rooms and television studios, probably. I'm Narelda Jacobs, and I've loved filling in on No Filter. Great to have your company. We'll see you next time. Buddha.